Welcome to Apropos. While protecting the environment may not be the highest priority for a country at war, the devastation caused to the Ukrainian landscape is part of a broader trail of destruction. Much of the country's 10 million hectares of forest land have been destroyed. Repairing that damage could take decades and cost billions. Jean-Emile Jamin has the details.
It was once called the Switzerland of Donetsk, but the former lush forests of Sviati Hory National Park in eastern Ukraine are now charred and smouldering, ravaged by the war that has plagued the country for over 20 months. Before, a sanctuary for wildlife and a source of pride for locals, now 80% of this national park is damaged or destroyed.
This forest will not recover. The undergrowth is very thick, it was burning, and it's going to smoulder for a long time.
In the heart of the park, forest rangers and firemen face a dual threat. The fires, often sparked by bombardment, are nearly impossible to extinguish quickly. The reason? The land is heavily mined, making every step a life-threatening risk. While tending to the forest last year, this ranger nearly lost his foot.
I checked that my leg was still in place. I took off my boot. There was no blood. It was intact. I crawled back to the car and drove home using just one leg.
Many others have been injured or killed by hidden mines and booby traps left behind by invading Russian forces. And all around, the scale of destruction is laid bare. Trees that stood for generations, nurturing the land and providing habitats for animals, now stand as blackened trunks.
None of this exists anymore. Even locals cannot go into the forest to pick mushrooms or berries. What we've lost is enormous.
Deminers, however, continue their work tirelessly, clearing dangerous explosives. It's a slow and painstaking process. The head of this demining squad says that on difficult days, they might clear just 5 meters of forest.
We've had days where we destroy 50 items.
With 425,000 hectares of forest contaminated by mines and a further 3 million hectares to inspect, the task ahead seems almost insurmountable. And that's just the start. Ukraine's former Minister of Environmental Protection says the process of restoring forests will take up to 7 decades and cost billions.
We will need many years after our victory to assess the damages.
Some experts, though, doubt this ever to be possible, citing similar damage caused by previous European wars. For reference, World Bank reports estimate that the war's environmental toll has exceeded $30 billion, including $3.3 billion in direct damage and $2.6 billion in repairs. In response, Ukraine says it's seeking to hold Russia legally accountable, pursuing around 40 individual criminal cases over the forest damage.
To discuss, we're joined now by environmental scientist Dr Eoghan Darbyshire from the Conflict and Environment Observatory, which monitors and raises awareness about the environmental dimensions of armed conflicts. Eoghan, thank you so much for being with us on the programme this evening. It isn't the first thing we think about when we consider the impact of war, but it causes huge damage to the environment. And we're not just talking about, we saw some of it in the report there, air pollution, deforestation, rivers and soil are also contaminated. As an environmental scientist, what exactly are you seeing?
Well, it's firstly, thank you for having me on tonight. It's a very important topic and often doesn't get enough attention, because what we see when we observe this in many places, Ukraine, Sudan, Myanmar, Colombia, similar sort of stories emerging. And it's various and vast diversity of environmental impacts from war. Some of these are very direct and we can easily comprehend them. So you might have an individual shell in a farmer's field blowing up. That destroys some soil, it destroys the microbiota in the soil. On the other scale, you have a very large-scale impact, such as destruction of whole landscapes from deforestation or catastrophic events like the Kakhovka Dam collapse we've seen in Ukraine. So they're the very direct, obvious things we can see. But there are maybe more, less visible, direct or indirect long-term impacts. For example, Elsewhere in Ukraine, we have protected areas, biodiversity hotspots, which are a long way from the front lines, but still impacted, either as refugees go through them, or as simply the people who work there, the scientists, are conscripted to fight. Then even at a global level, there's kind of impacts. So it might be how wars prevent progress on climate action. People are talking about war rather than reducing emissions. Or it could even be the vast amounts of emissions which are generated through fighting wars and from militaries.
And Eoghan, how is this type of pollution actually monitored in conflict zones when you can't always physically get to these areas? We saw drone footage there coming to us from Ukraine, but what kind of techniques do you use to actually observe what's happening?
Well, this is exactly what we do. We try to remotely assess environmental harm in conflict settings. And this is quite difficult to do, as you might imagine, from a long distance, but it can be done. And the way we do it is by looking at the footage from ordinary civilians that they might upload to social media. It can be looking at satellite imagery and satellite data. And sometimes, occasionally, we do get data from the ground. And by combining that together, we can be able to tell a story about what's happened, about a pollution incident perhaps, and then speculate a little bit on the magnitude of the harm, what the impact might be on the people and the environment. But ultimately we are limited doing what we do remotely. Measurements are needed on the ground, but as I'm sure you can imagine, in conflict settings this is very difficult. What in peacetime you might have an explosion in a factory, and you would expect a response, lots of scientists, lots of politicians trying to work out what's gone wrong and trying to fix it, maybe people getting evacuated. Something like that simply doesn't happen in these war contexts. And it's all about what does... Sorry
for cutting across you there, but in that case, how can this kind of devastation be contained or slowed down, and how do you regenerate these areas?
So it's very difficult. The starting point is trying to understand what has happened and what the impacts are. But undoubtedly it takes a very long time. As was mentioned in the visual piece, there's still parts of France where you cannot grow crops due to the munitions from World War I. In somewhere like Southeast Asia, we're still having birth defects generations after Agent Orange was dropped over the forests. So it's very difficult, actually, and what we need really is more monitoring, more research, and I guess a higher priority for the environment when we're thinking about wars and conflicts.
And wildlife, of course, animals, fauna, flora, it's also really badly damaged. How do you gauge that kind of biodiversity loss? Again, it's exceptionally difficult. Things can be done. There's some quite exciting recent research which was tracking migratory birds as they were flying across Ukraine during the war, and they actually found how the birds responded to all the explosions and diverted their flight paths. So we can look to some of these novel sort of ways to look into how nature is impacted, but really it can be challenging. And Eoghan, there are also consequences for human health here. Experts say if we look at some parts of Ukraine, there are forests, there are areas that will never be completely demined, possibly. Following previous wars in Europe, whole forests are no-go areas. So what kind of impact does all of this have on human health? I think this is a million-dollar question. I think one thing particularly concerning to us is that a lot of modern wars are fought in urban environments. And in Ukraine, they're very industrial environments as well, or it could be somewhere like Gaza where they're just very densely populated. So what we're seeing is, populations exposed to lots of air pollution, water pollution, and how people respond to that, how their bodies respond to that when they are also stressed through psychological stress, or maybe they're malnourished, is a real kind of ongoing research question and something we need to understand better, actually. Eoghan, thank you so much for your time on the programme. That is Dr Eoghan Darbyshire from the Conflict and Environment Observatory. Well, that's it. Thank you very much.